In my effort to prove myself the best candidate for Congress in the 7th District of Georgia, I'm going to go over each of the other candidates, issue by issue, and talk about their flaws. We're going to start here with Mr. Mark Gonsalves, and I'm going to go over each issue in the order that he lists it on his website. So we'll start with the national debt. Restoring fiscal discipline to the federal government. And you can see that he's got a nice little debt clock here that's constantly rising. The United States is running annual deficits of more than $1 trillion. Our national debt has grown from $6 trillion to more than $22 trillion since 2000. Almost a fourfold increase in less than 20 years. No complaints there. I don't disagree with him. We will soon leave to the next generation a Social Security and Medicare system headed directly toward bankruptcy. Entitlement and interest costs are now eating nearly 70% of the federal budget, making it impossible to fully fund our military, to find the money we need for highways, homeland security, veterans, research, and border patrol. There was a time when Republicans were the party of fiscal discipline, the party of balanced budgets, the party of smaller government. Republicans were once the adults in the room willing to impose some restraint on the national credit card. It's time we lived up to the principles we once professed to be our own. Restoring fiscal discipline to the United States government will not be easy. Making hard but simple choices now is much better than expecting our children to make agonizing choices down the road. So a few issues to point out here. First is that Congress has no power to fund highways under the Constitution or research unless it's directly tied to one of their enumerated powers in the Constitution. So he doesn't even seem to realize what they're allowed to fund to begin with. The other thing is he doesn't talk about the atrocious omnibus bills that keep getting passed that are racking up this national debt. Not only are they unconstitutional because they have so much pork in it that Congress isn't allowed to fund, but they're also just atrocious because they're filled with so much garbage and nobody has time to read all of it. And they just keep racking up the debt. That's not even addressed in his whole statement here. We're going to move to the next issue, fixing healthcare. Step 1 on the road to fixing healthcare. Healthcare is eating 18% of our gross domestic product, more than any other nation on earth, up from 4% when I was a teenager. So I'm going to stop there for just one moment and just point out that America is the #1 producer of new medicines and treatments. That's why more percentage of our gross domestic product is eaten up in it. Also, we have the best healthcare system in the world. It's not without flaws. It's got its problems. But that's one of the reasons that is not factored into this statement here. Americans are by far the world's largest consumers of healthcare. Yet few know the real cost of a visit to a doctor or the tests ordered by doctors. We don't know the real cost of the prescription drugs. We don't know the true cost of a hospital visit. Healthcare is the only thing we buy without having any idea what it costs. Except with each passing year, our health insurance premiums continue to rise. The only ones who do know what things actually cost are the doctors and hospitals who bill the insurance companies that cut the checks. The first step in fixing our healthcare system is true transparency in the healthcare marketplace. Only when we shed light on who is charging whom for what will the marketplace do what it does best: create competition, drive prices down, and improve the quality of our healthcare. I don't disagree, but the problem here is that Congress doesn't really have the power to regulate healthcare. So as a member of Congress, which is the office he's seeking, he doesn't offer a solution. What Congress needs to be doing is removing regulations from the healthcare industry because they're not allowed to regulate it in the first place. And as far as transparency, that's something that really mostly needs to be addressed by the states. The federal government, again, doesn't have the power to regulate the market. The border crisis. Fixing immigration and the crisis on the border. No sovereign country can remain sovereign absent secure borders. A country that cannot control its borders cannot control its destiny. Mark Gonsalves. Throughout our history, immigration has helped fuel our economic engine and make us a vibrant, more prosperous country. But we, and we alone, should decide who comes in and who does not. I stand with those who believe we must secure our southern border. I stand with those who say we must enforce our visa laws, for half of the undocumented immigrants come to America on an airplane. I stand with those who believe our sovereign nation has the right and an obligation to create an immigration policy that can be enforced. Once we have done these things, we can sit down and discuss who should be allowed to come in as a guest worker and who is eligible to be put on the path to citizenship. So the problem here is enforcement. We have plenty of laws on the books on immigration. We just don't have the right enforcement, which is an executive issue, but it's also a judiciary issue. The judiciary they're blocking the federal government from being able to act on it. They're blocking the president. So the only thing Congress can really do is start to exercise their power over the judiciary, impeach bad justices that are ruling against our border laws and immigration laws, and then also pass laws that will restrict what the courts are able to rule on. That's the only way Congress is going to be able to actually fix this problem. Next issue. Stopping socialism. Stopping the march towards socialism. Anybody who has studied the rise and fall of nations, anybody who has studied history, anybody who is reasonably well read knows that the quickest route to economic prosperity is capitalism. Capitalism isn't perfect, but history teaches, beyond any doubt, it is a system superior to socialism or communism. Yet, in the past 5 years, too many Americans have soured on capitalism. Democrats came close to giving Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist, the Democratic nomination in 2016. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez quickly rose to national prominence based on her advocacy of socialist ideals. The reason many Americans find socialism appealing is capitalism has not worked well for them. So, I'm going to stop there and just make this quick comment. Capitalism has worked phenomenally well for Americans. They just don't realize it because we live in so much prosperity, we don't see what it's like outside of America. There aren't really poor people in America relative to the world. There's relative poverty, but there's not poverty by world standards. When we compare what is considered poor in America, it is way higher than basically any nation in the world. Beyond that, we're able to buy things and have comforts and luxuries that other nations just don't have and that never existed in the past. I'll continue, though. They are the young now saddled with an unconscionable level of college debt. They are the one-time factory workers who saw their jobs shipped overseas thanks to trade agreements that did not treat American workers well. They are those who took it on the chin in the recession of 2008, who never recovered what they lost. They are those who have survived on stagnant wages and gone without a raise in the past decade. They are those who have seen crony capitalism make and enrich dozens of new billionaires who have profited from rigged rules. Too many workers in the United States have no real inflation-adjusted income growth since the Reagan years. The top 1% own more of the wealth in the United States than the bottom 90%. So a few points here. Actually, everybody has had income growth. We just don't realize it because we can buy flat screen, HD, even 4 and 8K televisions that didn't exist in the 1980s. Cars are more fuel efficient. We have Wi-Fi in basically every home. We have technologies that just did not exist back then that we can buy for a comparable price of goods that today would be considered way inferior. So that's not actually true. We have way increase in growth since the Reagan years. You're just not looking at it from the right perspective. The second thing is the top 1% own more of the wealth in the United States than the bottom 90%. That's like a Democrat talking point straight up. I mean, it's almost verbatim Bernie Sanders 1% versus the 99%. Is he advocating for capitalism or socialism here? I don't know. There are hard questions that need to be asked about the concentration of wealth in the United States and why a system that is supposed to lift all boats has lifted too few. Saving capitalism and the system that made America the greatest economic engine on earth requires all Americans have a fair shot of climbing the rungs of the economic ladder. So, that last point, he didn't make any real solutions. So, how do you get there? The answer is we can remove regulations that shouldn't even exist constitutionally. And we need to get rid of the minimum wage because not only does the Constitution not allow for Congress to pass a minimum wage, but the minimum wage hurts people who are going into the workforce more than anybody else. It prevents them from getting lower wage jobs that they can work their way up and climb the economic ladder. You knocked out the rungs from the very bottom just with a minimum wage. And then the next thing is, what is capitalism? Capitalism is a free trade of goods. So being able to freely trade is what allows us to climb the economic ladder. Socialism is the abolition of private property, eliminating private property. To secure capitalism, we just need to stop confiscating wealth from one group and giving it to another and have basic regulations that are very plain and simple and within constitutional bounds that are easy to follow. We don't need these massive regulatory agencies that are passing massive amounts of regulations crippling our economy. None of that is addressed in here, and like I said, he gives a Democratic talking point near the end. Next issue, wars without end. America must stop fighting wars without end. The United States is deployed in more than 150 countries around the world. More than 165,000 military personnel serve outside the United States, which is actually a low number compared to the 20th century. In Vietnam, for example, we had over 1 million servicemen easily. We stationed in excess 25,000 troops in South Korea, where they're at constant threat from North Korea. 35,000 in Germany, more than 55,000 in Japan, and we have troops in Thailand, Singapore, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Australia, Bahrain, Egypt, and Romania. In the past 30 years, we have been involved in armed conflicts in Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Somalia, Bosnia, Haiti, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya, Uganda, Syria, and Yemen. So a few of these, real quick, were because of the war on terror. We fought in Iraq to dispose the third largest military in the world to take out Saddam Hussein, and we fought a lot of members of Al-Qaeda over in Iraq and killed a bunch of them. Not to mention, of course, ISIS in more recent years. Before that, we fought in Kuwait to defend them from the Iraqis, from Saddam Hussein, in Operation Desert Storm, and in doing so, they're the freest nation, save Israel, in the Middle East. Many of these other nations that we've been involved in, Afghanistan, of course, was a war on terror, fighting against the Taliban in order to get at Al-Qaeda. In many of these other countries, we've been involved in as humanitarian efforts through NATO. So it's kind of interesting that that's mentioned. Nonetheless, we'll continue on. Since the close of the Cold War, 13 nations have been added to NATO. The United States is now treaty-bound to defend the safety, security, and territorial integrity of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, Croatia, Albania, and Montenegro. Okay, sorry for my bad pronunciation on some of these nations. The point is, basically all of these were nations that were under Soviet rule. The Soviet Union had them as satellite states and had military occupation over them. The point of NATO is to prevent Russia from expanding and taking control, and so we're treaty bound to defend them because they were conquered by the Soviets in the past. Now, we can say the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but Russia still aims a bunch of nukes at us. And another quick little point is that the NATO treaty has only been used once. Only one time in the United States, or in its existence, which was by the United States after 9/11, when all these nations essentially came to our aid because of it. The world has changed since World War II, when NATO was necessary. The Second World War, when NATO was necessary. NATO was actually formed after World War II, but okay. The Soviet Union is no more. Russia is a shell of its former self, and yet we're issuing war guarantees to countries most Americans could not find on a map. So a point to that real quick is that, like I already said, the Soviet Union doesn't exist, but Russia still aims a bunch of nukes at us. And Putin is trying to reestablish it. When he conquered Georgia in 2008, and then the conquering of Ukraine, both former satellite states of Russia trying to be reestablished. So just because they're a shell of what they were doesn't mean they're not trying to regrow and become what they once were and then some. We've invested trillions fighting endless wars around the globe with no clear objective, no exit strategy, no definition of victory. Since 2001, more than 6,500 troops have lost their lives fighting the two longest wars ever waged by the United States at a cost in excess of $1 trillion. So a few points there is every loss is tragic, but that is the lowest number of troops lost in basically any conflict, especially for how long it's lasted. I mean, nearly 10 times that were lost in Vietnam, and it lasted 8 years, whereas we've been in the Middle East since 2001. We've been in there for coming up on 19 years. So it's actually very low because of our improved technology, our better training, better equipment, all this kind of stuff factor into that. The other thing is $1 trillion. We have, as you saw, $23 trillion debt. That is a small price compared to the massive amount of money we're spending in everything else. I'm not saying that these aren't things that we should be concerned with, but it is small in comparison to what it has been in the past and what other things we're spending money on, such as entitlements, which aren't even constitutional. The military, of course, being the main purpose of the federal government to defend us militarily. And education, which the federal government shouldn't even be involved in, except for within Washington, D.C. and the territories where they actually have authority. Okay. How long can America remain the world's policeman? How long can we afford to defend a Europe, I think he meant offer defense, a Europe that refuses to contribute their fair share to NATO? What vital interest do we have in the many nations where troops are stationed? So a few things on that is that how long can America be the world's policeman? Well, when America disengaged from Europe, World War I broke out. Then after we came in and put an end to that war, we disengaged a second time, basically, with the exception of the League of Nations, which was a complete failure. And what ended up happening was the Second World War. When America disengages and stops being the world's policeman, the world, it gets pretty bad out there. And we end up going in and having to bail Europe out. So by stationing troops, we prevent some of that stuff from happening. And not entirely, because we haven't kept up with defending Georgia, for example, and defending Ukraine as best we could. Few in Congress have dared suggest that we re-examine our role in world affairs. But in light of enormous cost of blood and treasure the past 20 years, that time has come. Going forward, Congress should reassert its rightful role in deciding when and where we go to war, and when we do not. The interesting thing there is the problem with Congress deciding when and where we go to war, it's not really up to just us as Americans, because the thing about war is our enemy has a say in it as well. Our enemy wants us destroyed, and they're going to attack us. We do need to re-examine certain aspects of our foreign policy. There's no question there. There's waste. There's issues that we can definitely resolve. But wars without end, how long are we going to be involved in wars? Well, that also is up to our enemies. It's not just up to us. But if we want the world to be a safer place, we need to be engaged. If we disengage, it's going to get pretty bad out there. Not that it isn't bad already. Next issue, student loan debt. Millennials face the worst debt crisis of any generation in history. There was once a time when society placed a high priority on higher education, a time when the older generation went out of their way to bestow to the young a better start than the one they had. For good reasons. Society needs well-educated young people entering the workforce, landing good-paying jobs, paying federal taxes, contributing to the Social Security and Medicare fund, buying homes, owning cars, having children, and raising families. At one time, states also played their part. Most states supported colleges and universities derive 65% of their operating budget from the appropriations made by their respective state legislatures. Today, less than 30% of the funding for colleges and universities come from state appropriations, as state support has declined, tuition has skyrocketed. Well, also, as the federal government keeps increasing student loan guarantees, the price of college keeps going up, which isn't being addressed right there. So let's go on. Over the last decade, student loan debt has more than doubled to $1.5 trillion. Millennials now carry the greatest debt burden of any generation in history. The debt burden is not driven by mortgage or credit card debt. Student loan debt is 74% of the total debt owed by those aged 25 to 34, a seven-fold increase since 1989. As a result, homeownership rates among those 24 to 32 have declined. Young people are putting off having children and raising families. Little wonder that the birth rate in America has plummeted. The cynics may say it's their fault, but in the end, it's the country that will suffer if college debt becomes a lifelong stranglehold around the neck of the country's youngest, or young. Or if college education becomes a privilege extended only to the offspring of wealthy parents. For the sake of a country that needs a healthy and prosperous young generation, we must look for a way to ease the debt crisis plaguing America's millennial generation. So it sounds like he's wanting to do student loan payoffs like Elizabeth Warren. I don't know, but that's what it sounds like. The answer doesn't lie in government on this. Those who have taken out debt do have the responsibility to pay back their debt. What needs to happen, though, federally, is the federal government needs to stop guaranteeing loans, stop issuing loans, and stop being involved in the loan process. State-supported colleges also probably shouldn't exist, in my opinion. If we stop supporting them through government, through taxpayers, then we're going to end up supporting them only through the private enterprise, at which point more competition will drive down price, increase quality, and increase accessibility, actually, instead of, like Gonsalves was saying, make it where only the wealthy are able to afford it. Competition creates tiers because they want to get in as many people as they can in order to make profit. So the next thing is the opioid epidemic. A real war against the opioid epidemic. The opioid crisis is destroying us from within. Last year, 70,000 died from opioid abuse, twice the number killed in traffic accidents, and a fourfold increase from 10 years ago. It is forcing our courts to separate addicted children from parents, addicted parents from children. It is taxing the resources of law enforcement trying to stop turf wars among gangs, working to shut down drug cartels, and for medical personnel who must constantly respond. Opioid constantly respond opioid-related emergencies. There should be a 2 in there, I think. Okay. It's a national problem and a Georgia problem that requires a solution. 1. There must be a public education campaign about the risk of opioid abuse and how to keep them out of the hands of children. Parents should fully understand the risk of leaving prescriptions sitting on a shelf or in a medical cabinet. Okay. So this automatically is suggesting that it's neglectful parents that are causing the opioid crisis by leaving their prescriptions in easy access to children. I don't think that's the problem. The problem is overprescription and stuff like that. It's not that children are getting their hands on it. That's not the main bulk of the problem. Okay, 2. Physicians who overprescribe are part of the problem, just as I said. They're unwitting contributors to the addiction problem. We can insist the AMA better educate doctors on the kind of prescriptions that lead to addiction. Law enforcement must clamp down on doctors who overprescribe dangerous drugs. This is true, and unless it's crossing state lines, however, it's not a federal issue. It affects us federally, but it's something that the states need to be cracking down on. The federal government, unless, again, it is crossing state lines, technically isn't a federal jurisdiction issue. 3. The pharmaceutical industry must be held accountable for their role in creating this mess. The companies making and distributing opioids know exactly what they are doing. Every new addict they create is a profit center until the patient dies. Taxpayers are footing the bill for treatment centers, overburdening hospitals, and medical personnel constantly responding to drug-related 911 calls. Small-time drug dealers go to jail when they get caught, and rightly so. When the bad actors of the pharmaceutical industry get caught, they pay a fine, then they go to sell some more. The quickest way to send a message to bad actors is to put a few in jail and throw away the key. He's not entirely wrong there. I think that we need to do stuff like removing medical licenses to those who overprescribe. Stuff like that is the way that we're going to really begin to crack down on it. And if we need to regulate the drug, we'll need to come up with solutions that will actually regulate the opioids themselves. At one time, they were regulated a lot more than they are now. They weren't. The opioids that are on the market today through Purdue Pharma weren't available in the past. The China threat. Containing China's threat to the United States. For years, the United States looked the other way as China manipulated its currencies, ran up huge trade surpluses with the United States, stole the intellectual property of the United States companies, and tolerated leaders of a communist regime who lied about what they were doing. So let me address a few things here. So China manipulating its currency doesn't actually benefit China in the long run. It benefits them in the short run, but not in the long run, and so therefore their currency manipulation ultimately hurts them. Running up huge trade surpluses with the United States also, trade deficits and trade surpluses don't really make that much of a difference. It's really the benefits that we get out of each other. If we want to talk about trade with China, the biggest problem is that we do trade with China in the first place. It gives us cheaper goods, that's true, which is a main incentive for us to want to trade with them. But it also emboldens and supports a communist regime that is terrible to its people. It's tyrannical. And if we did not do trade with China, they would ultimately have collapsed like the Soviet Union did and be just a shell of what they are today. Okay, and so we have tolerated communist leaders, which is a problem, and we've allowed them to steal intellectual property. I think to a certain extent, companies can do better to protect their own property from this, but we probably could find ways to prosecute in some manner or punish with either trade-related issues like tariffs, stuff like that, to punish China for stealing our intellectual property. What was happening was known to our ruling class. There were reasons they remained silent. American companies reaped enormous profits by locating facilities in China to exploit cheap labor. As the middle class in China grew, it created new markets for American products, fattening the profits of American corporations. Lax Chinese environmental laws made it cheap for multinational corporations to make products in China instead of the United States. That's true, and to make ourselves more competitive, we can do things like reduce our taxes and reduce our regulations to make us more competitive. There are ways that we can combat that, and we can also, of course, put tariffs on China because of them being bad actors. In 1986, our trade deficit with China was $6 billion. In no month since in no month since have we had a trade surplus. Last year it was 419 billion, an all-time high. So that means that a trade surplus means we're buying more products from them than they are from us, which ultimately is taking away their resources and time, but that's another issue we can address. Today we pay a price. By some measures, China has already become the world's largest economy. It has invested its trade surplus in building a world-class navy. It now occupies international shipping lanes in the South China Sea. It provokes and threatens our allies. It is headline news when China's economic growth dips below 7% a year. In the United States, we celebrate when our economy grows more than 2.5%. Congress has known for years about the rise of China, its annual double-digit increase in military spending, and the theft of American technology. Because little was done to stop it or counteract it, we face the real possibility that China will someday own the Pacific and far surpass America's economic might. We can no longer be satisfied to bury our heads in the sand. It's time that we recognize we are the only power on earth that can contain China's goal of world domination and force it to abide by the rules of peaceful nations that play by the rules. So one thing that's not addressed here is Hong Kong. China's trying to oppress Hong Kong, and we need to actually act possibly with some military force. That doesn't mean we need to deploy troops. We can station naval ships and put pressure on them through intimidation, not just absolute force. And we ought to. China is a bad actor. There's a lot of problems, and we need to free that nation so that they can become free, like the United States ultimately. The way that they oppress people too, such as Christians and Muslims, is a problem. We need to do more to secure the rights of the people of China. We'll move on to the next issue, the Second Amendment. Protecting the Second Amendment. Our founding fathers enshrined the Second Amendment into the Constitution, and it means what it says, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The language is clear and absolute. Count me among those who will vote to preserve this right for all law-abiding Americans. So he shows his support for the Second Amendment, but doesn't offer any proposals of how to do so. I believe we should pass a law that would ultimately eliminate all state and local laws that infringe on the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment applies to both state and federal alike, period. So that the right of the people to keep and bear arms will not be infringed by any of that. That's what needs to happen. That's what ought to happen. He doesn't propose that. He just leaves a short statement showing his support. Finally, last but not least, and in my opinion most important of all, is protecting life. Oh, I guess it's not last. There's also free speech. Count me among those who believe that all life is precious and deserves protecting, including unborn babies. I will fight to stop late-term abortions, oppose taxpayer-funded abortions, defund Planned Parenthood, be a reliable voice for the unborn in the United States Congress. The interesting thing here is that he says he will fight to stop late-term abortions. Why only late-term? You said yourself that all life is precious. We need to protect life from the moment of conception. I want to do away with the morning after pill. I want to put an end to abortion, full stop. If we're not protecting life at all stages, then we're falling short of our duty to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's what we need to do. So I'm for the pro-life amendment. I'm also for just passing laws that are backed by the 5th and 14th Amendment to protect life. And I want to protect it at all stages, not just late term. Let's see. Finally, freedom of speech. Okay? Private monopolies are restricting free speech. Without free speech, we are not a free nation. Without free speech, you are not a free people. Or person. Sorry. Mark Gonsalves, May 2019. We face a situation today our founders could never have anticipated when they enshrined the First Amendment into the Constitution. Well, let's start with that. Actually, they could. That's why they enshrined the First Amendment, because their freedom of speech was being suppressed. The whole point of the Stamp Act was that you could only get things published that had the stamp of Great Britain on it, so that the paper was produced in the United Kingdom and not in the New World. Yeah, they understood what limiting free speech was about. That's why they put the First Amendment in there. Facebook has become America's newspaper. Facebook is a privately controlled monopoly whose owner is now more powerful than the president, a man who has now decided who gets to say what, silencing those who violate his arbitrary and ever-changing standards. So Facebook is not more powerful than the president. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg can deploy military forces in other parts of the world and issue executive orders of how they're supposed to execute their business. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have the power to get anybody arrested. That's insane. Facebook is a privately controlled monopoly. Well, what is a monopoly? Facebook's not a monopoly. A monopoly would have no competitors and would be government protected to ensure that there's no competitors. But there are competitors to Facebook. Facebook has Twitter is the number one example, but there are other social media accounts too that are competitors to Facebook, and therefore Facebook is not actually a monopoly. Is it a problem that Facebook regulates free speech? Yes, but they are a private institution, and we can create competitors to them. I don't know that there's a government solution to this. Google has become America's library. Google is a privately controlled monopoly whose owners determine what we see after entering words into a search bar, who is allowed to post what on YouTube, silencing those who violate their arbitrary and ever-changing standards. This is actually a bigger problem than Facebook. YouTube is the highest trafficked website in the world, and Google is a much bigger company even than Facebook. That's a bigger problem, and that is just a much bigger problem. That's just it. Coming soon to the United States is a debate about the First Amendment and how we preserve a freedom that has kept us free. I stand with those who want to preserve the freedom that keeps us free and curtailing the power of monopolies to control our national dialogue. So basically, free speech is actually not most regulated from here. Yes, there are free speech issues here, but free speech is also a big problem on college campuses, which he does not address. And he also doesn't offer what solutions he offers. He doesn't offer any solutions. And he doesn't talk about what the Constitution actually allows us to regulate when it comes to speech, because Congress actually can't abridge the freedom of speech according to the First Amendment. And Congress can't really regulate private industries. We can regulate them to a certain extent when they cross state lines, because interstate commerce is within the power of Congress. So there may be some things that we could discuss when it comes to that. It is a problem. It does need to be discussed. He doesn't offer any solutions, and I'll probably have to make some videos to offer some solutions. At any rate, this has been Mark Gonsalves. This is the first person that I've analyzed their website on, and I'll analyze some more. These are the problems issue by issue, going by what he has put on here. And at some point, I'm going to have to issue my own videos on each of these issues and what I think on them. But this has been Zach Kinnamore going over the issues of Mark Gonsalves and why I'm a better candidate for the 7th District of Congress than he is. Thank you for taking the time watching my video, and have a wonderful day.